Hi, everybody. It's June, and again, great space topics to talk about as we are making space mainstream this month. We've got some great guests. It's going to be a lot of fun, and as always, the gang is all here. Your Fab Four, and we are glad that you are joining us for Liftoff. So we'll do our little introductions in case you're joining us for the first time. And if you are joining us for the first time, I promise you'll probably want to come back again and again and again. My name is Meredith Garofalo, and I am the host of the Rocket Girl Report. My nickname's been Rocket Girl as I've been covering a lot of launches and stories on satellites and rockets, being a TV meteorologist and space and science correspondent for the last 16 years. I right now am writing, no pun intended, for our space.com. I do a lot of space and science and weather stories, and especially as we'll talk about a little bit about space weather. But so glad you're here, and let me introduce Dr. Plant, Daniel.
Yes.
Well, agricultural scientist, going on 20 years now. And yes, doctor of plant medicine, so plant pathology, entomology, soil and water science, and really agricultural systems at large and food in particular. So excited to be here.
I always love that. Daniel, I really want to get into how you got into space, because I love that aspect of your story, because I don't think you started going that route, right? And you kind of got pulled into it. So let's explore that during this conversation, because again, I think it's a lot of what we're trying to do with this conversation is bring more people into this world. So we'll get to that. Hello, everybody. Space Ace here, Ubaldo Ciminieri. I am working for an organization, a space company called Cislunar Industries, where we're building space foundries. So think of steel mills in space, and that it's like bringing sci-fi to life for me. Like, it's really just amazing, this incredible work that they're doing, and so many others in the space industry now, and the commercial sector especially. It's just really exciting, and I love being able to share all of that with you and with other audiences, again, to make space mainstream. I want people to talk about it like they talk about their Starbucks. So that's what we're talking about today. But first, I know, shouldn't it be though? I mean,
I'm sorry, I'm a Dunkin' girl, though, I have to say.
Fair point. That's a fair point. How we talk about our coffee, maybe I'll
yes.
clarify. Yeah. But I also wanted to talk about real quick too, and again, this plays into this, how cool last month that we all got to see the Aurora Borealis. Meredith, I want to hear from you about that, because as space weather, and that's one of the things I'd love to see on the nightly news.
Yes.
Part of the nightly news focused on space weather. But talk about that event and like how amazing it was that it sort of connected people from all over the world.
As you all know me, I am not speechless a lot. But I'll tell you, when I was coming out, I just had some pizza, and I'd walked out of the pizza shop, and the sky looked funny to me. And as a meteorologist, when the sky looks funny, I think about severe weather. But this was interesting, and I know in the back of my mind they had talked about the potential for auroras as far south as even into Alabama. And so when I pulled out my phone, and I'm like, I'm gonna take a picture and see what this looks like. And then I saw the green, and I'm like, oh, it's here. This is actually happening. So of course my mom lives in Cleveland. I call my mom, it's Mother's Day weekend. I'm like, Mom, go outside. I'll meet you at home in like 5. And literally when we stepped outside and brought the phones up, because as we know, you could kind of see it with the naked eye, but with the phones, with the filters, with moving the different settings, it was incredible. And did anybody else see it, by the way, that's here?
Oh,
I hope I wasn't the only one.
No, it was amazing. I mean, it was, and you're right, it's funny because everybody got out their phones, and it's like, okay, 10-second exposure,
Right.
no flash, like really figuring out how to use your camera for the first time. I mean, it's, and with the naked eye, it was very, very faint. But then, as soon as you took a picture, it was incredible. And that, that to me just is, that says a lot about the things that we can and cannot see just in general. But here you
Right.
have this. But then it was so cool because I have family kind of from all over, and I've got family in the UK and I have family in Argentina. And I started getting all these pictures and videos from all over the world of just these incredible sights, you know, those pillars of lights that you can see.
Right.
And it just, man, it was just one of those, kind of like the eclipse, you know, where everybody just came together for a couple hours, and it just, you know, flooded social media with everybody's amazing pictures. I don't know. It was just, it's such a great way to kick off this conversation that we're having today, because it's things like that. Like, how do we take that and just make that, you know, happen a lot? I mean, well, clearly we don't want solar flares blasting the earth every
Right.
day, but you know,
They're not
just the
so nice too.
conversation.
Just saying.
Yeah, exactly. Well, can you talk about that just for a couple minutes? Like,
Yeah.
what do people need to know about solar flares?
Well, you know, that's the interesting thing is I saw a lot of other TV meteorologists in the industries putting in more and more into their social media, into their newscasts by the evening. And then what is actually happening? I mean, social media was lit up, but it was really interesting to me to see more people in my field that don't typically talk about space or space weather. And all of a sudden, they were jumping on, they were trying to find out information. And for me personally, having my connection already established in space, I was reaching out to my friends at the Space Weather Prediction Center. I was talking to solar physicists and saying, oh my gosh, let's talk about this. And actually, all weekend, I learned more probably within those 3 days talking to scientists and researchers than I've learned in school or my career.
Yeah.
And I'm nowhere near an expert, but I can confidently say now, because of this event as an example, I was able to get so much information that I was able to put together some articles for space.com to explain it. Just like we explain when weather happens with severe weather. And another thing to go along that is with space weather forecasts. They're just like weather forecasts for the country. Although we don't see the more bigger impacts as, say, a severe storm is moving through, we still have to put these out, because I was talking to the one scientist from the Space Weather Prediction Center and said, we actually have a call that goes out 24 hours before the potential of a geomagnetic storm, which they had to do to get those power grid operators to say, hey, take your plans in place. This is looking bad. So they actually were able to, based on the information, give that advanced warning. And so for those of you that might not be familiar, what happens is you have that massive sunspot like we had on the sun last month. And when it sends off the explosion, the solar flare, what it can also send is what's called a coronal mass ejection, or CMEs, as you might see it online a lot. And that's like a big old bubble, kind of like when you watch the rocket launch and you can sometimes see that big, beautiful bubble in the sky. It's something like that that's traveling through space, but it's supercharged with geomagnetic particles. And when it interacts with our magnetic field here on Earth, that's when we have the potential for auroras, but that's when also we could see the impact to the power grid. As it's traveling through space, there could be impacts to spacecraft or to astronauts that may be out there working. So there's a lot of really cool things that are going on with that. And for this month's Rocket Girl Report, I am so excited right now to bring us a special guest from the field, and we're going to do a little bit of a Q&A for the next 15 minutes and talk about space. All right, Rocket Girl Report time. So excited for this week because we're going to talk about something I think everybody who watches the podcast was chatty about in May. Dr. Tamitha Skov, who is a professor and retired research scientist from the Aerospace Corporation, is joining us this week. Tamitha, so great to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here.
And we're talking about something that we both love, weather and space. And the space weather for the month of May, that first aurora event, I mean, so much was learned from that. And you were following it. I mean, what were your thoughts, especially leading up to it? Because there was a lot of, is this going to happen? Is this not going to happen? And then boom, we have this historic event.
Well, to be totally honest, that I knew that this was going to be the first real test of our infrastructure in our modern age. because our solar cycles have been getting a lot weaker over the past, let's say 30, almost 40 years. And we knew that things were going to be changing starting around this cycle, but I didn't expect things to be hitting it quite this hard this quickly. And so when we started getting this particular region, which was actually two regions that merged together, when this kind of cluster of sunspots came together in a very angry way, it started rapid firing these big solar flares and solar storms at Earth. And we knew this was going to be an historic event. And we had to worry about whether or not our infrastructure, like our GPS and our Starlink satellites and everything else, was going to hold together, because it really hasn't been tested yet.
And some of the scientists I was speaking with at the Space Weather Prediction Center were saying it was literally, no pun intended, the perfect storm, the way everything just came together for us to have this class 5. And next thing you know, people were seeing the auroras in South America, all over the continent, as far south as Florida. And it was mind blowing.
Yes, I think one of the furthest reports as far as going south was Yucatan. So that's pretty far south, and that's what's expected with a G5 storm. And on top of that, we have far more sensitive cameras today than we ever used to. In fact, you can actually take pictures of aurora with your cell phone camera that you can't even see with the naked eye. So the types of reports that we were going to have coming in, we knew prior to this event that they were going to be historic. And as a matter of fact, one of the field reporters that I know actually told me that at one point during the peak of the storm, aurora photos and aurora itself was a key search term in Google. It was trending with over 2 million searches.
I was one of them, I'm not going to lie. It was incredible. I mean, I shared the experience with my mother. We had never seen anything like it in our life. And my mom's home, my childhood home. I mean, I think what was incredible too was how the whole world for a period of time came together and nothing else mattered. Politics didn't matter. The world problems didn't matter. They were just all living in the moment and appreciating it.
And that's one of the gorgeous gifts of space weather. There are a lot of things when it comes to space weather. I always call it a mixed bag because there's a lot of good and a lot of bad that comes out of it. But aurora is definitely one of the benefits, one of the gifts that our Earth gives to us, as it shows us how it's protecting us from these extreme events. And yes, it absolutely has a way of being almost a spiritual experience for many people, especially first-time watchers. And it brings folks together because just like the night sky, when people look up at the night sky and they see that gorgeous Milky Way above, there's something awe-inspiring about it. And aurora does exactly the same thing. And it doesn't matter what language you speak, all you have to do is point up and everybody knows exactly what you're talking about.
Now, I know a lot of people were commenting, well, oh my gosh, I had to use my camera. It wasn't that real. Let's talk a little bit about how the cameras, it's like a telescope, and it kind of enhances that experience. Like, we wouldn't have been able to see what we did during totality without the telescope, just like having those phones gave us the vivid colors that to our own eyes would just have not been possible.
Right. And the reason for that is not so much that the colors aren't really there and the camera's seeing something that doesn't really exist and inventing colors. It's that the way our eyes work. Our eyes have both rods and cones in them, and it's the cones that see color. But the problem is that the cones don't really see, they're not really that light sensitive. And so just like you see with totality, as with the eclipse, if you're in totality, you can actually watch a particular effect. I forgot the name of the effect, but it's when the colors begin to fade because the light becomes so dim that everything kind of takes on kind of a grayish cast. And the reason for that is because our cones are giving up the ghost, so to speak, and letting the rods take over the seeing. But rods only see in black and white. So that's the same problem that we have with aurora, is that most of the time the aurora is extremely dim. And although it's extremely colorful, it's not bright enough for our cones to register it in our eyes. It's our rods that mainly register it. And so we see more muted colors. So it's more like a faded pinks instead of bright reds, or faded greens or grays and whites instead of, vivid greens and oranges. And that's historically been a problem. But when the storms get really big like this, a lot of times the aurora becomes so bright that you do see the colors even with the naked eye. And that was definitely the case with this storm.
It's just so beautiful. And like we said, it depended on where you were at, the different types of colors, the different views. Now, how hard is space weather forecasting? You've done that. So I do weather forecasting as a meteorologist, but it's kind of the same thing. There are a lot of challenges that I think the general public does not see or understand when it comes to making a forecast about something so ever changing, whether it's the Earth's atmosphere or the atmosphere in space.
Well, to be totally honest, there's actually a really good way of looking at space weather, because space weather today is essentially where terrestrial weather was back in the 1950s. We have barely anything more than a tornado siren. And the reason for that is because we actually see a big solar storm lift off of the sun right at the sun's doorstep. And after that, that big solar storm becomes extremely invisible. And so for the intervening 99 million miles that it's got to traverse, we really don't know where it is and how well it's doing. There's very few markers that we have to indicate whether it's still coming, if it's still on course or that kind of thing, because the solar wind can really blow these things off course and distort them. Plus, we can't really predict what the magnetic field direction is going to be, and that causes a whole other problem for us. So when I tell people about how hard it is to predict space weather and whether a big event off the sun is going to hit Earth, I say it's very much like trying to guess if you have a friend who lives in New York and they're going to drive to Los Angeles, right? And you are asking, what is your estimated time of arrival? The only thing you have to go on is the speed at which they backed out of their driveway.
Wow.
That's about as hard as it is for space weather.
That's really good. It's like the analogy with weather we use sometimes. It's like try picking your top 4 teams in the final 4. When the final 4 groups come out, it's a challenge, and it's a science like anything else. And we learn a lot from every event. What would you say scientists learned most about this event, especially as we have that rotation of still a pretty active sunspot coming back around?
I think what we've learned is that the work that we're doing to mitigate problems that we have historically seen with these big G5 class events, those mitigations are working. The power grids did feel the issues. They definitely felt this storm, but we have procedures that are put in place now that we didn't have back in, let's say, 1989 when we had the Hydro-Quebec failure. And those procedures, as they're put in place, they teach the operators what to do. These people now know how to handle the grids, what to look for, and how to operate differently in order to avoid the cascading failures that we've seen in the past. And that is probably the best takeaway that I can possibly imagine. It's like the best scenario. So it gives us confidence that as more of these G5 level storms hit us, because they are going to start hitting us as our sun continues to get stronger and more active in these upcoming cycles, it gives us more confidence that our technology will be able to weather the storm, so to speak.
That's a really good way to put it. And, I think we continuously learn that no 2 sunspots are alike. One that might, grow and stay active could die off quickly. I mean, we think of I believe the Halloween storm that was back in the 2000s is a great example. Super active, it rotated around and then nothing.
Yeah, that was actually in 2003, the October and November Halloween storms was actually a series of storms. And there was actually quite a few interesting stories to tell when it comes to that particular event series, because not only did we have satellite issues and a lot of different anomalies that told us a lot about what type of infrastructure we needed to, make more robust, but it also taught scientists a lot more about making sure that your operational instrumentation is operating with all of its safeguards on, because we actually had some events that kind of damaged some key equipment at the time. So we're a lot smarter, and every single time we have a big event such as this, it always teaches us something new.
And we were just talking about how, we're approaching the solar, this is one of the busiest times for the sun right now, but it's not over just yet. It's not like we have one big event and it sucks all the energy out of the atmosphere. For example, hurricanes, you have one big storm, but it takes the warmer water, you get a little bit of a break, and then, it takes some time for things to build back up again. I mean, we could see this activity continue as we head into the summer.
Oh, absolutely. We can see this activity continue into the summer, actually into the fall, into next spring. In fact, we will likely be a bit busier on what we call the declining phase of the solar cycle than we even were on the ascending phase, which was the phase that we've just kind of gotten through. We are now in the solar maximum phase, and there's likely going to be 2 peaks to the solar maximum. We may have just seen 1 peak, and now we're going to have a little bit of a lull and maybe pop into a second peak here over this next year. And things are going to start getting even more active. So the chances of us getting another G5 storm with this particular cycle, I would say, are pretty good. Will we see one nearly as intense as this G5? Maybe not quite, maybe one that's not quite as long, but it's really hard to predict. Likely we're going to see something near the end of this cycle too, because these solar cycles always seem to have what we call last gasps. It means that right before we go into solar minimum, there ends up being a massive event, a massive sunspot cluster, that what we call a bad actor, that just wreaks havoc during its period of rotating across the Earth-facing disk. If you recall, 2017, in September of that year, we had a very bad actor, region 2673, and it caused major problems during hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and then Marie for Puerto Rico, because it absolutely decimated all of the radio communications that they were using for emergency communication with those devastated areas.
I think that brings up a good point, that these events aren't just about getting out to see the aurora. I mean, there's a lot of different factors that could impact things that we do every single day. And it's really important to pay attention to these forecasts, almost like we pay attention to our daily weather forecasts.
Well, and that's absolutely true. And in actuality, it's even more that we need to have terrestrial weather forecasters and space weather forecasters working together, because the real perfect storm that I'm concerned about is when we have things like hurricane season pairing up with a big bad actor on the sun that then causes a lot of communication hazards, search and rescue issues because of GPS and GNSS outages, and all of these different things that just conspire together to make a bad situation from a terrestrial weather perspective or a disaster perspective even worse.
Absolutely. What do you, as you were a research scientist, when these events happen, personally, what do you look forward to them? Is it the learning? Is it seeing what happens? Is it a little bit of everything just kind of coming together and studying the before, during, and after?
Well, as a research scientist, what I cut my teeth on was actually trying to understand the topology of these structures as they left the sun, and getting an idea of what we call their geoaffective nature, which is whether or not the storms themselves, when they left the sun, if they were magnetically organized in the right way to cause big storms at Earth or not, be something more akin to a bumper car. Because these structures are really, they're just magnets. And if you think of fridge magnets, the Earth has its own magnetic shield, and that extends up into space. It's not just the one that you read on the ground with a compass. It extends up into space and it protects us. But that magnetic shield is kind of like a big fridge magnet. And if the sun is throwing other fridge magnets at you, then those fridge magnets, as they come together, if they're oriented the same way, well, they'll bounce off each other, and the solar storm magnet will just kind of move off and do nothing. But if you reverse it, they'll click together and their magnetic systems will become one. And then all of that energy can be pumped into the Earth system, which is what happened with this G5 storm. And so for me, it's really the research that gets us closer to predicting what the magnetic field orientation is of these storms, so that we know when we need to be concerned and when we don't.
I love it. Dr. Tamitha Skov, really appreciate you being on our show. Is there anything else you'd like to add that you feel our viewers might be interested in, or where can they find you if they want to learn more about what you do? I know you have such a great presence on social media, and one of the things we always stress too is follow sources that are accurate, follow real sources, and you're obviously someone that they should follow.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that very much. Yes, we have a very active community on Twitter of both of scientists as well as, and so academics, as well as those in industry and in operations, and field reporters. We have just an absolute ton of people online that can help navigate help people navigate not just space weather questions, but also when to see aurora, when do I go out, is it happening above me? There's always somebody out there that can answer those questions. So definitely get online, and Twitter is probably a great place. And if you want to see my forecasts, of course, go on YouTube. But for those who are actually even like you, Meredith, who are looking into space weather, and you have terrestrial meteorology expertise, come check out Millersville University, because we're training terrestrial meteorologists in space weather expertise so that you can have literally a sun to mud perspective and really become that modern meteorologist for the 21st century.
I love it. We're going to have to talk after the show. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yay, you were amazing. How'd you feel?
Fine.
Good.
Very good. Yeah, thank you for the softball questions. I appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. The one thing you did bring up that I would like to pitch to my boss at space.com, if you're up for it, was the whole thing about the hurricane season and space weather forecasting, because I just put an article out about how this could be one of the most active hurricane seasons for the Atlantic.
I think I read it, and I just my whole body just goes, ugh, I get that sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. I hate hurricane season, especially near solar maximum, for this exact reason.
Yeah. Would you be open to that? I would love to get some. I'm going to pitch it, and then also see if the director, National Weather Service Director Ken Graham, is a dear friend of mine.
Oh, good.
So I might see if I talk to you, and then I talk to him, and that you guys can kind of play about the clip.
He knows me.
Good.
And I haven't had a chance to do much other than say hi. I see him at the space weather workshop from time to time. I think he was there last year, not this year, but the year prior. So I said hi to him. So I'm sure he might remember me in passing. So that's wonderful. Yeah, anything we can do to connect terrestrial weather and space weather together. Oh, that's the ideal, because we need to have this stuff on the 6 o'clock news, so to speak, when when it happens and when it's relevant. And what people don't understand yet in the general populace, as well as a lot of people in industry, they don't understand, because space weather is such a global event, right? You have aurora, and it unites everybody, and that is wonderful. And it's a very critical part of space weather. Thank goodness we have that part. But space weather is also very much like terrestrial weather, that once the storm hits, what happens really depends upon where you are. Where you are on the day side or the night side. So what we call local, basically local time, where you are in latitude, because high latitudes get totally different effects than mid latitudes, which gets totally different effects than low latitudes. I oftentimes talk about the mid latitudes being the Goldilocks zone for space weather, because it doesn't get all the problems typically of the aurora, and it doesn't get all the problems of what we call the equatorial anomaly that is down at low latitudes. So really, we need terrestrial meteorologists, especially broadcast terrestrial meteorologists, to have space weather expertise, so they can talk about the issues with their own communities. Because otherwise, the alternative would be the same as having a single terrestrial meteorologist for the globe saying it's going to rain today, and you would never think of doing that, right? I mean, that's just silly,
right?
But that's what we're doing right now for space weather, and it's silly. And it's not going to work in the long run. And so that's one of the main reasons why I'm training terrestrial meteorologists. We can't have just a few places that are doing space weather. We have to have it locally for the specific communities that people are being served.
Yeah, meteorologists can't. And I've seen this, people in my industry, they'll throw up maps just for clickbaits or likes. Ooh, this aurora's coming. Here's this. And it's like, they have to be responsible, just like with news and responsible journalism. I mean, there's a responsibility. And after covering this for space.com, I'm thankful, because that's really got my interest into learning more and talking to you and talking to people at the Space Weather Prediction Center. And I'm learning so much, and it's like, gosh, I would love to help. So if there's anything I can do,
come to next year, come to the Space Weather Workshop if you can. You'll learn so much.
When is it normally?
April, always April. April is close to the end of the year in Boulder. So I don't know where are you located? Are you in Colorado? Hopefully.
I'm in Cleveland, Ohio right now, but I'm kind of seeing where my job takes me. I have a couple of things coming up. I've been doing freelance work. But I do love Boulder, and I love Colorado. So yeah, we'll definitely have to talk before then, or maybe we could talk in I could, if you need presenters, I could, from the TV side, talk about, the challenges we face and, the things, how like I see stuff with weather forecasting and, with space, like kind of like what we talked about in the articles
Right.
I've done. I mean, if I could bring a interesting perspective, I would love to help out with that. Having done both forecasting, for weather and then also lately doing the space weather stuff.
Right. Well, we'll definitely talk about it and see what comes out of it. We'll have to see where our synergies lie.
Yeah.
Sadly, as far as the space weather woman stuff, I'm just a one-person shop. I mean, I run all this equipment, I do all my forecasts, it's all done. I don't have a team. I do it all by myself. So
Wow.
it's a bit intense. But the whole point though is, I always tease my students. I say, look, I don't want to be space weather grandma. Right? I want to be able to teach people how to do space weather forecasting and have a connection with their communities so that it's not just the government agencies that are doing this. We need to have people who know how to communicate to the general populace, to non-experts. And that's something that our community, that I even know terrestrial meteorology still fights. I mean, John Morales is a good friend of mine, and he told me years ago when Matt Parker was invited me to sit on a panel with John. This is back at the AMS, like back in 2017, 2018. And John said, Tamitha, he says, I may work in South Florida, right? And he's Emmy winning and the whole thing and FEMA Region 4. And, he says, my audience is the most savvy audience probably of any in the United States because we're so worried about hurricanes, right? He says, we
Right.
know my audience, my community, they know wave height and wind shear and, and he went on and on and on. And he said, but my producers, he said, they're constantly, hitting me over the head saying, make it simpler, stop using the big words, no scientific language, make it shorter. And he says, I can't imagine. He says, I have that big problem, doing what I do. I can't imagine how hard it would be to do that with space weather because you guys have even more bizarre terms and bizarre concepts and electric and magnetic fields. I mean, that's non-trivial to communicate. So he really instilled it in me early on that the perspectives that a lot of my colleagues have, which is we need to teach the public our language, that's just not going to fly.
Right. Right.
So the more we have people like you who are A, interested in space weather, and B, have a skill set in communicating to the general populace, the more we need to plug into your abilities and have it kind of translate some of this stuff for us.
No,
So
that sounds good.
we just got to keep plugging along no matter what,
Amen, sister. That sounds good. All right. Have a wonderful rest of the day and we will chat soon.
Sounds good, Meredith. Have a good one. Okay.
Thank you.
Meredith, that was an amazing report. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that interview. It's, all of this information is so fascinating. And I'm always curious, Daniel, like with the solar flare and with what happened, what are you tracking as it relates to your work?
Yeah, the big takeaway for me, I'm currently deep into writing a white paper on space agriculture, sustainable space settlement, in particular, kind of the biosystems that go along with it. And one thing that really comes to light is this massive buffer of atmosphere that we have, and this massive buffer of water, the oceans that we have to kind of, right, the solution to pollution is dilution, is we really lose a lot of these things. Oh, well, we changed this just by a few parts per million here, right? Or, oh, well, we don't really have a solution for this, but hey, it gets diluted out. And the cool thing about this solar flare that brought to light is the one chart that I saw that was really enlightening, where all the different colors hitting the different portions of the atmosphere, highlighting like this massive composition. You don't really think about nitrogen, right, being up in the atmosphere and such. And it just brings to light that, you don't see it. The atmosphere is relatively thick, so it kind of is a good buffer to a lot of these problems, but it's also, outside of that, there's nothing. So it just brought to light, going back to, the things you can't see, right? It really kind of highlighted almost the atmosphere that we just kind of take for granted, but is truly a buffer in many ways. and a very physical one when you're talking about air quality and such.
Yeah, I love that because in some ways, I mean, it really truly makes Earth and humanity unique, right? I mean, there's so many reasons we shouldn't be alive for everything that gets thrown at us from the universe, but
I know, put
here
our
we are.
super shields up. Come on, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and this is a great segue from science fact to science fiction, and also because oftentimes it's science fiction that sort of leads the way and inspires then what's happening with science fact and particularly in the space industry. And so I'm really excited to introduce and bring on our first guest, John Billingsley, who you probably know from Star Trek Enterprise. He played Dr. Phlox. So I want to say hello to you, John. Welcome. And yeah, tell us more. I mean, obviously, Dr. Phlox is, kind of a key part of your experience, but tell everybody else, tell everybody what else you're doing, because there's so much more that's really cool and exciting.
Yes, well, thank you so much for letting me join this conversation. And I'm looking for a way to connect what I do to the themes that I think you're interested in bringing out. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to figure that out, but although I am an actor primarily, I'm also somebody who's worked for many years as a volunteer in social services in the social service not-for-profit world. And for the last 8 years, I have been helping to build out the capacity of an organization called the Hollywood Food Coalition to share and rescue food for people in need in the Los Angeles area. If there is any direct connection, I suppose, between what I appreciate about Star Trek and the work I'm doing in the social services sector, it's the fact that the show Star Trek, I'm going to trust that probably most of the people who are watching have some familiarity with the Star Trek ethos, is the concept of federation and the idea, Roddenberry's sort of vision that there was a theoretical possibility that we could set aside our doctrinaire differences, the absurd issues that seem to uh, enrage us these days, rooted in race and ethnicity and religiosity and etc., and come to a consensus that we are all in it together on this planet and have the capacity to grow, change, evolve, explore, and do better.
Amen.
To me, amen. To me, the nature of how that gets put to the test, and in a way, the question that Roddenberry didn't want to try to answer, he wanted to say, let's have a hopeful vision. How do we do it? How do we get from here to there? How do we get from where we are today, where, I won't lean into the negative, but clearly we are living in a somewhat atomized and balkanized world, and arguably a world in which more and more people are leaning towards authoritarian solutions. How do we get from where we are now to a place where we could actually take the best of us out into the universe? What is the point of taking fascism into space? What is the point of taking criminality into space? What is the point of taking violence into space? To me, one of the great challenges, and to your point, Ubaldo, what interests me about this conversation is the idea that the ethical challenges we have to meet today have to be met on the ground in partnerships and in coalition to help people do better. A lot of the work I do revolves around food as a medium for helping, for building coalitions, in addition to serving a hot meal every night of the week to all comers, which we've done for 37 years without missing a night. My wife and I were instrumental in helping to build additional capacities, one of them being to rescue and share more food with other small not-for-profits working in the social services sector. The idea being that food provides a certain kind of connective tissue. So we share food with battered women's shelters, with homes for at-risk street kids, people undergoing drug and alcohol rehabilitation programming, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The nature of what coalition building to me is all about is how we find ways to bring all of the service providers together to share resources, share knowledge, share systems growth. If there's anything that might be paralleled in the space industry, I would imagine, this is not my world, that y'all are engaged in much the same challenge. How do you bring together disparate groups, disparate enterprises, and come together for a common goal?
Well, and that, that's, I wanted to start there because, and Daniel, I'd love to figure out from the food perspective. I think that's where my mind kind of initially goes first, because the idea that there's some great work going on in regards to food in the space industry. And so Daniel, you probably know a lot about that. And so what is it like, and how could that tie back into what John's talking about, and to take all of this amazing innovation and apply it to Earth?
Yeah, absolutely. As John, you're probably familiar, what's often said is, we have plenty of food in the world to feed everyone. It's a logistics challenge. So it seems like that's, where the Hollywood Food Coalition is coming in here, to bridge that gap. And getting onto the topic of logistics is in growing it and growing the food, however, whatever food production system it is, it's really a supply chain logistical challenge. It's how do you get these inputs into these systems? How do you get the labor out there? How do you process it and preserve it? I've worked pretty much through the food system, all the way from seed all the way to the shelf on the store. So I've had a really pretty in-depth look at the systems. As much as I'm kind of plant diseases and plant doctor, it really takes a holistic approach when looking at how to go from seed to table. So yeah, and in space, it's really a deep thought because there is no supply chain. So everything is much more sensitive. Just like, you don't have this atmospheric buffer and this ocean buffer for massive amount of air and water. You don't have that supply chain buffer there. You have to really do, on-site creation, and you're very supply chain sensitive. So in some of the, sure, can we solve it for short missions? Yes, coming together on the long-term missions, that's what I work kind of within in the broader space biology community, where we're trying to solve these really long pole technologies, these really far out there things like sustainable space settlement, food production systems that are really totally outside and independent of Earth systems, but still relying on biology. And I think the hope is that if we can demonstrate these systems, they can be deployed and they can help create food where there are really extreme temperatures, are really extremely limited resources. So I think some of these long out there space settlement conversations, oh, what's the relevance of this? But actually, if you look at it scientifically, you look at it from a practical standpoint, it actually has a lot of parallels with the types of technologies we're definitely going to need in the next 50, 100 years. When we get into a post-oil world, how do we do this? That's one thing that brought me into this, is just thinking all the challenges we have just switching here on Earth kind of to a post-oil world are massive, from the chemical supply chain to the energy we use to what land we use and transportation. It's it's almost too much to solve for, right? All at once on Earth. But in space, it's instantly your first challenge.
I think to address something that you keep bringing up, Ubaldo, in our conversations, and I think you're bringing up here, I mean, to me, I think one of the challenges is how do you have a conversation that envisions an optimistic future and actually discusses what the practical realities of bringing people together are in a political construct that can actually get things done here on Earth? And I never want to shy away from that conversation, because I think sometimes, as an outsider, not a member of the scientific community, I kind of feel like that's the gulf we fall in. It's hard sometimes, as Joe Schlabatnik, to hear people who are very learned and who have extraordinary scientific expertise talk about a future that, for me, seems unrealizable because we can't get three people in a room deciding what they should have on their pizza without having a fist fight. And I forgive me, but that is always what I kind of feel like has to somehow be brought back into what you're talking about, Ubaldo. How do you make it seem relevant to Joe Schlabatnik? How do you make it seem feasible to Joe Schlabatnik? What is the connectivity that allows what you're talking about to actually have some resonance for folks like me?
Yeah, I love that point. And it's interesting because uh, over the weekend, I had this conversation multiple times with different people, from different aspects of the space industry, and people who are just space enthusiasts. And I think on one end of the spectrum, you have a lot of people who are sure that we can't connect with big swaths of the community who are just trying to make it, and who are making minimum wage, and they have a family to take care of. And kind of to your point, John, what does this have to do with me? What you're talking is all this scientific stuff, all this jargon, all of these these words and things that I never had an opportunity to learn about, right? And so there's no direct connect there. And then on the other end, it is those super scientists and astrophysicists and who don't, like clearly they love what they're doing, but there's a disconnect there. So what do we do about the middle? What do we do about getting everyone to really want to share their ideas, or be interested and sit down and want to have a conversation? And I think for me, there's this idea that we need to invite people in. Like, we need to invite everybody, and maybe that's how I'm defining mainstream in this conversation, is we need to invite any and all voices from all different walks of life to be a part of the conversation,
So
starting
just
there.
just for the sake of, because I'm not cantankerous by nature, but I do believe that you have to have a robust, honest conversation. You've invited me in.
Yeah.
Where do I sit at this table? Because it's what I think you have to keep asking if you want to bring people into a conversation about space. Then my first question, and it's a question I've talked to about this with Anara, is from my perspective, why do I return to the table?
Yeah.
Why do I return to the table? I think there's something, Dr. Tompkins, in what you're suggesting, which is that the expertise and authority you have in certain spheres has relevance to the work I do. I just need to know how that relevance can be applied in a very specific way. I think you're absolutely right, Dr. Tompkins. It's so much of what the problem is, it's a logistical problem. For me, I look at a lot of organizations in this welter of food rescue world work, and it seems to me more efforts to find, locate, store, refrigerate, transport food, more efforts collectively to find places where that food goes. That's logistical. I know that we've had some conversations with Rand. We get a lot of advice, but we do not have working relationships really with people who might have the expertise, knowledge, and skills to help effectuate change on the ground. Some of that is because the not-for-profit world is resistant to collaboration because our funding sources we silo. We're afraid we're going to lose our money if we try and work together with other groups collectively. Some of it is, I think, this kind of collaboration. It's unclear what it means.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no easy answer there for sure. The supply side is, I think, that's the side I work on mostly. I understand those other challenge points there, and I think on the social side, it's interesting seeing the amount of time people spend on screens versus doing more or less something in the physical. People like to still help out in the physical world, and it'd be interesting to try to bridge that gap and say, okay, 80% of your day is screen time or something like that. But, is 2% of your time doing something physical for, in quote unquote, the real world, to help solve some of these basic things. That's something that I often go back to, just like a healthier society in general, is just how do we get less screen time and more human time and more just physical time? It just seems like it's generally healthier. I know it's healthier for myself, but not, at the same time, you have human labor in food systems that's incredibly taxing. So,
Yeah.
it's there's some people that have very little screen time, lots of physical time, maybe too much human time. You know, traveling abroad, you really notice that food is people's medicine, their entertainment, their social connection, and it seems like that, you know, in space definitely works. You know, whenever food goes up into space, it's definitely a bonding moment between crews.
I was just going to really echo the point that Dr. Tompkins was making. A lot of what attracted me to the Food Coalition is that we have volunteers coming in to make food, serve food, hoist and lift and get food out to neighboring organizations. And over the 37 years of our organization, that's been thousands and thousands of people. And you learn how to give back by giving back. And I do think it's important to, you know, get out of your living room, get off the screens, and go and do something in your community. That's been a big animating drive for me. It's one of the reasons that we're talking, Ubaldo, and one of the reasons I'm interested in trying to get members of the science fiction community more involved in and more open about discussing their philanthropic work and trying to connect it to your industry, because I think that's where some of the tissue, the connective tissue, has to lie.
No, I agree.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Meredith. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, and you know, with talking about getting the word out and being able to connect to the people, I mean, it has to also come through the mainstream media. And I think there needs to be more of a push to get these space stories out there, to get these important stories told, because there's so much. I mean, I get it, like murders and drama and all that, but it's like there is so much more that's happening out there. And I think as communities, we really need to work together to get these local stories out there. We've talked about this in previous episodes, and it's pitching these stories, not just to the national level, but starting at the local levels if there's that connection. Like, John, if there's something happening in a community, going to the local papers, going to the local TV stations and saying, hey, this is important. And it's not just about the celebrity aspect. It's about space in general and why people need to start paying attention to what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. For me, I guess maybe the biggest question too, and this goes back to John, a lot of what you're talking about is like, what's in it for me? You know, for each individual person, from a media perspective, you know, I think it's always sort of about that. Like, why should I care? And so I want to bring Dr. Claire Nelson in. So she's our second guest. And I want to have a conversation about, Claire, first of all, the work that you're doing related to storytelling and, you know, analog astronauts, right? And things like that. And how you're approaching getting more people involved in space. You know, and then I'd love to kind of have all of us talk through that a little more and just, see where we come with that. But how are you, Dr. Nelson? Good to see you.
I'm great. I'm actually at a spectrum management conference in Jamaica, the Caribbean Spectrum Management Conference, and they're talking about the spectrum, which of course is related to this whole conversation on access to space. Most people don't realize how important the spectrum is to our daily lives. And backing into that, since much of the information and the technology communications are coming from space, you know, it's a very important space as well. I kind of look at this as from a whole systems perspective. I am blessed with a brain that operates on two fronts. On one side of my brain, I'm very hardcore engineering, and the other part is very, you know, fanciful theater, etc. And so because I think there's not a lot of time to waste, I approach it from both sides. I got into space literally because I wrote a story about being on the moon. I was focused more at the time on getting planetary consciousness, recognizing that the precipice of doom, so to speak, that humanity is standing on really could be best looked at from a point of view of a few of us being out there saying, you know what, it's actually one planet. Let's forget about nations and see if we can create a virtual nation, if you will, of people who are globalist and planetary conscious type people. Then backing into that, realizing that whoever it is that controls the narrative on space is definitely going to control the future of humanity. I thought this is very important in that we really be intentional about trying to democratize that access. And so storytelling is a good place to get people who don't see themselves at all by reminding them that, you know, their ancient mythologies always spoke about the moon goddess or, you know, sun goddess or something. So they've always had a relationship. Those of us who know our horoscope. It's still a part of using space in a very emotional and spiritual sense. And at the same time, I thought it would be remiss of me to not do something on the engineering side so that I'm not dismissed as a gadfly, that's kind of being a problem person trying to stop people from doing things. And so we're able to get a small grant to get a climate science project started at Morgan State University. And the test of that project has been very challenging, I must tell you, because we have universities in Jamaica, Mauritius, Australia, and Finland that we're trying to work a very simple project. But unfortunately, it was very under-resourced. We had no idea what it would really cost to do this. So we're just operating by breathing deeply and hoping we can get more volunteers on board. And I say that to say, I think that approach is the best approach, because what we're doing in Africa and Caribbean, knowing how long change takes to happen, and the space agencies in some places don't exist. We're working with engineering schools to begin to educate young people about, okay, now you know about climate change, but do you know how to read the data yourself, and how to do a sensor, and how the sensor ties back into satellites? So we're backing into it from that way, getting those people who would never normally think about space to say, hey, oh yeah, space or Earth, I get it. And so that's why we're using the angle of doing the space clubs on the one hand, getting engineering schools to begin to talk to each other, and on the other hand, continue to perform and tell my stories about my life as the first Jamaican on the moon.
I love it. It's so
yeah.
inspirational, I mean, and especially when you talk about climates, and I like to bring up this point because I've seen it in the media, especially how climate change, where it's at now, is where space was when it began 10 years ago. 10 years ago, climate change was something that was kind of talked about, and now it's front and center. And I feel like we're seeing a parallel now where space is starting to get talked about, but in the next 10 years, we do have the responsibility. We have to tell these stories and get the information out there to get these future generations excited about it.
Yes, yes, yes. So the analog astronaut was a way to get the students engaged and excited, because it's all well and good to do like a small project that's intangible. When you're talking about actually going out and doing research in the field, and in the case of the ones I'm trying to do in Kenya and Ghana, trying to get them to see it's not far-fetched. I mean, in the case of Kenya, they have a space agency. I know the US for sure is courting them heavily to join the Artemis Accords. But if it doesn't translate to the people, it will be like a very bad political move. So having the engineering schools, and they're begin to do more work in terms of educating and focusing on space to Earth in terms of the remote sensing we need for agriculture, water management, peacekeeping. All of those things are going to be vital. So I think that being able to tell the story both at the, let's say, mythological level, as well as be able to bring it down to reality, where if you're able to get schools involved and have the kids understand that the weather data comes from having access to these chariots that are riding in the stars, so to speak, and then seeing themselves as part of that. And then for those kids who are naturally born more fanciful, because some people are just born fanciful, there might be some kid in the middle of the desert that will never can't even read and write. They might be dreaming right now about, riding in the stars. And so you want to have that ability to say, okay, your ancient culture talks about that. They found a site in northern Kenya, Namaratunga, which they believe was an ancient stargazing site of the Kushites. And I'm like, wait a minute, those people are in the Bible. I was kind of excited to see that. And so it just looks like old rocks, but the scientists are studying it now to see the positioning of those that were the standing ones. And they believe it's a stargazing site for the ancient Kushite. So you never can tell what those rocks in your backyard, certainly if you're in the desert in Ghana or Kenya, what those rocks might actually mean something that we have no clue.
And on the Earth observation side, how that data is used globally, and how it's data that NASA makes freely available.
Exactly.
It's really interesting seeing how that levels the playing, because it all looks the same. Whether you're working on Earth observation data in agriculture in UK or Argentina or Africa, there is both the platforms that are used to utilize that data, as well as the raw data of itself. It's almost like a globalized data set. So
that is very important. Getting more schools and students taught to be able to read the data and utilize the data is highly important. In the Spectrum Management Conference here in Jamaica, they're talking about underserved people who don't have access, don't have the bandwidth. And so this conversation, things we have to decide, is it okay, for example, for one company to own all the spectrum, to be controlling all the spectrum? It's a privately held company. How do we then say, okay, Starlink, it's very good that you're doing this, but where do people get to have a say in what is being done? So we really have a lot of things to talk about in terms of where this future is going to shape up and shape out, to ensure that as we're looking at all the different, let's say, subsectors and sub-issues that make up being able to be conversant in and inclusive about how we share space. I think all of us have to be better educated. And certainly those young people who are thinking about going into politics, they better know more than just American history, because it's not going to be enough.
They don't know American history, in part because, again, the structural reality of our country is that there is an overclass that does not want people to be well educated. There are 40 kids in a class in an LA unified school district from disparate cultures with disparate backgrounds, disparate educational capacities. We are not educating our children, and we have right now a system that is not particularly interested in educating our children, which is why I keep wanting to kind of come back to there are some structural problems that have to do with the way we run our systems, the way we we organize ourselves. It's hard for me on the ground in Los Angeles trying to work in a social system that is deeply flawed, because our politics are deeply flawed. And I'm wanting to say this with all due respect to the extraordinary work that all of you do, but I really want to keep coming back to your question, UB. What brings me to this table? What brings other people like me to this table who don't have your skills, who don't have your knowledge? And I think, to your point, Dr. Nelson, what brings a kid into this world and keeps him there when he comes from a culture or a society in which he sees poverty, in which he sees want, and he doesn't make the connection between what you guys are talking about and his daily life? I think that's a societal challenge that I don't have any answers for it. I'm obviously in a narrow sector in a narrow world, but I think it's what you keep bringing up, UB.
Yeah, I think we have to start with the fact, and I hear you very clearly, we have to start with the fact that everybody has a phone. Everybody's walking with a smartphone. Honestly, when I was younger and going to engineering school, I was into Star Trek big time, right? But I didn't really make the connection that this could really be a real thing, right? That you could have this thing. It was just a nice fantasy, and I watched many episodes over and over and over again. So by the time I got to America, I grew up in Jamaica. By the time I got to Jamaica, I already was seeing reruns. So by the time I got to America, I was probably seeing them the third or fourth time, but I was so much a fan of Star Trek. Now I know why, right? Because deep down I maybe had a dream to be on a starship or something. But I think I like to always start with the cell phone or the weather, things that are real for them, or GPS. Because that, if you can make GPS relevant for them, then even if they're not going to be a space cadet the way like myself and all of us on this call probably are considered space cadets, quote unquote. I like to use the term with a tongue in cheek. Even if they don't become space cadets, you want them to be educated enough so that when they become a citizen voter, for example, they're aware it's not just up there doing nothing. This is important because it's going to define how we share data. It's going to define what we teach in school. It's going to define, and especially now that they don't have to really learn anything, they better learn how to think.
And I realize that I have a tendency, even within my own organization, to be the Cassandra of the Hollywood Food Coalition. So forgive me, but what are people watching on their phones?
It's interesting because I was going to hold up my phone when talking about that Earth observation data, because you can literally program, and that is the equalizer, is that if you have a smartphone, the same systems to utilize that data you can access right on your phone. So it's almost like how almost anyone can create an app for your phone. Anyone can utilize this data, but mostly, right, information is abundant and widely accessible through the internet. making your daily actions connected to that data, I think is
Yeah.
the most important thing. And
Yeah.
that's something that we can do is we can say, here's the data. This
Yeah.
is why I'm choosing to live this way or structure my day this way or my life this way.
And on the pro side, you have this extraordinary capacity that you didn't have before, an educative capacity.
Right.
Absolutely. On the other hand, more people are watching porn than have ever watched porn in the history of the world. And that is also a technological reality. The question, it seems to me, is the divide between people who are educated and smart and scientifically inclined, futuristically inclined, and between people who have been intentionally ghettoized by a power structure that doesn't want them to learn and have been sold bread and circuses from the time they were able to speak, gets bigger and bigger and bigger, arguably. I find that to be a cultural challenge.
Yeah.
And
It is
also
a
so
cultural
much.
challenge. I want to jump in here because one day I was watching this dancing, right? And I thought, dancing might do more for diplomacy. Dancing might do more for world peace than diplomacy did. And I was thinking, you said, what are people watching? I remember when I was growing up in Jamaica, when man landed on the moon, we had a dance in Jamaica, the moon hop. So I'm just thinking I should probably do a cartoon moon hopping around and try and get it, be like go viral or something. And then maybe they will
We can make that happen.
back into it from doing the dancing, because everybody wants to do the moon hop or something. We have to, for me, I think we have to try whatever it is that's going to get their attention. So if it's a story, if it's a dance, it's a song, you kind of have to meet people where they are, because as you said rightly, John Billingsley, people are just being dumbed down. It's just really sad.
Yeah.
That's a good, yeah. Oh, go ahead, John.
No, I totally get that, but I guess for me, and I'm not going to say that I'm a structuralist, but when you're working in a not-for-profit, it's the day in day out challenges is keep the door open, keep the meals moving forward. How do you figure out how to get from point A to point B? The structuralist in me says to educate people and to give them access to the arts and to do everything you're talking about to encourage people to understand the complexity of the world we live in and be excited about it requires changes in a structure that is diametrically opposed to doing any of these things. And
Yeah.
that is an opinion I hold, and you may disagree with it, but in my opinion, the authoritarian countries, and we're seeing more and more authoritarianism sweep across this globe, have no interest in an educated population by definition.
What
Yeah.
about,
So
what do you guys think? I was going to say, what do you think about how we regulate information on like social media? I mean, we go back to, for example, this weekend with the solar flares, and there were a lot of really good educated people out there that were putting out facts. And then you would have someone that would copy something from 3 days ago and post it and get like 1 million clicks. I mean, how can we as a society be better? I mean, is it reporting these people? Is it talking to the makers and saying, hey, if you don't have a PhD or some background in this, I don't know.
I think it's the colliding of spheres on a social side that can help solve this. And it's twofold. One, when you're doing these activities and you're saying, hey, this makes me feel good to volunteer to help, in this way. Internet comes back around in a positive feedback loop where you post that and you get all these likes. So it encourages this bridging in the physical sense, but then also in the social sense. And often that's where innovation happens, is when kind of worlds collide. So I think opposed to the authoritarian system where this is your box, this is what you do. We're all going to build these boxes and we're going to go here. That's where this nebulous social, both digital social and physical social, I think could come into play for a win. That
the optimist in me looks at somebody like Francis Perkins, who was Franklin Roosevelt's labor secretary and who created a lot of extraordinary social programs in New York in response to need. And when Roosevelt took office, he pulled Francis Perkins, he had been the governor of New York, into his administration, and she was largely responsible for many of the programs, including arguably Social Security, that we now take for granted today. But on the other hand, the reason Francis Perkins was successful was because we had 30% unemployment and we were essentially looking at a world in chaos and collapse. Much of what's happening right now, I think, is social organizations and community-based groups are responding to the fact that the federal government and arguably a world government is ignoring these problems and intentionally turning their back, arguably, on these problems. yes, I think that there has to be some kind of grassroots effort to educate and inspire people. But I do think it begs the question of what is the political challenge of our times, and what is our
Yeah.
role? What is your role as scientists to respond to authoritarianism, to political maladroitness at best, and flat out evil at worst?
To win, frankly, I've been asked that question directly in a number of spheres, and it's to show that this can come out as the greatest positive, net positive. And so if we can show that, right, sustainably, right, the social side, the technological side, the economic side, that is the challenge at hand, to imagine new futures and build towards them way before, right, these current systems are able to really feed into. So I think, like you said, it's grassroots. It's it, and it
Yes.
encourages that open thinking, right, and that collaborative thinking, and that,
Do
hey,
you, do you
yeah.
guys
Well,
feel, because I'm an
my wish
outsider?
list,
I'm sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah,
Vicki.
my wish list was that when I wrote the book Smart Futures for a Flourishing World, and I picked the term smart futures, it came up because I thought, well, everybody's talking about smart this and smart that, but we're kind of approaching from a very dumb perspective. And my hope was that, if I can start using the term smart futures and people asking, what does that really mean? And I can give them my 5 principles, eventually it will spread, because I'm not going to require that you have to be certified in thinking this way. Just take it and run with it and make it work for you. And I do think we need to kind of find ways in which those of us who are thinking intentional about how do we create things that reach a broader base of people, to first of all, take it out of the norm where you have to be certified to say you can think about this in this way, as I'm trying to do with my book. And then I had I write stories to hopefully make it stick more and people want to talk about it. But we have to find these ways of meeting people where they are, being intentional, writing the stories that are fun stories and hoping some piece of it sticks. Everybody knows who Spock is. Even if they didn't grow up with Spock, people in the generation still know about Spock. How can we create these characters that carry these values that are going to help us talk about are we going to go with Star Wars or Star Trek? I mean, Star Trek was definitely about peacekeeping as much as possible. And so even the name Star Wars is like, okay, we don't want to go in a Star Wars in the general thinking. We rather more people remember Star Trek, because at least it feels us like, we're journeying, we're exploring. We're not trying to create conflict or to make conditions for conflict to occur. And so I think those of us who are scientists have to be a little bit activist. And I know many scientists don't like to do that, but those of us who feel like we are born to be change makers and change leaders and change artists, and I think it behooves us to not be embarrassed to say that we are, and not and say, oh, I'm a scientist, I'm above all that. I'm going to say I'm an engineer, and I am intentional about knowing, yes, we have the power to destruct and we have the power to build something that is beautiful. So let us try to awaken that sense of building something that's beautiful, because trying to do something that's going to be destructive in space, and it's a deterrent, right?
Yeah.
At some point, there could be a very tragic accident. And so we have to find a way for us scientists and engineers and architects and storytellers to really write these stories that begin to change the mindset. And the beautiful thing is that I read that Rensselaer said, a study at Rensselaer said that you need 10% of a community believing in a particular vision of the future. So what if each of us in our own sphere were to create visions of the future that are optimistic, not what I call kumbayistic, right? Because we're humans. It's not going to be like, kumbaya, everybody's going to be happy. But some way of what I call this normatopia, where yes, we're still modeling along, but we're modeling along with a sense of we are going to be thriving, we're going to be flourishing. Yes, we'll have pockets of grief and conflict, but we're not going to have the big conflict out in space, which for me is my biggest fear. My biggest fear is that we have a big conflict in space. And that's what I'm intentional about, writing stories and creating conditions so more people that feel like me to talk about it and to make the country for the story of peace for use of outer space to become a reality.
I mean, the only thing I would add to that, which I think is very inspiring and beautiful, is that I think there has to be a conscious effort on the part of the various industries, businesses, systems, entities that exist in the scientific world, a conscious partnering with organizations that are operating in the social sector to actually create change on the ground that is practical, visible, and obvious. Because if it's and I'm an artist. I mean, I was a writer myself. I'm an actor. I believe very much that arts education is one of the things we're abandoning globally, that I think is, at the heart of a lot of our problems. But I think if there isn't something that can be perceived and seen as actual measurable growth on the ground in terms of helping people live better lives, that the science world and the space world can say, we've helped, we've done this. If those connections aren't made clearer, I don't think you achieve what you're looking for, Ubaldo.
Very true.
Yeah.
And I like that. So maybe we
Yeah.
can start a underground movement to get people to do this, to do this work. John, I mean, the beauty about it is that we have all these AI tools as writers. We can use AI movies, that we can create a whole web series that we can concoct together and get, maybe get some traction on that. But we have to do something with what we have. And you said rightly, we don't have a lot of funding, but hey, it just moves the time and energy and create a new also structure of ownership of these things. Why do we have to wake in a big studio to authorize us? I'm totally like, let's do our own thing. I mean, it's a different world. Let's create our own thing. People have their cell phone. We can come up with a webisode type of I don't know, serial movie, that involves all of us. And we make it happen. Why not? I believe it's possible.
Yeah, this is great. That in this, John, you and I've had multiple conversations and about this, right? And I think this conversation that you and Dr. Nelson have been having back and forth is really inspiring me to think about this differently. I mean, I have always thought, and I think the reason why we connected, John, was thinking that, that there's this built-in fandom to the entertainment world, right? The creative arts world that can be, sort of that first step in reaching people, because they already love you, for example, as an actor, right? And so, yeah, I know you think you destroyed the Star Trek world back in the early 2000s, but I don't think you did. But anyway, but you know what I mean? Like, I think, as a step one or a phase one, meeting people where they're already at, which is that, oh man, I love my Star Trek, or to your point, Dr. Nelson, I love my Star Wars, I love The Expanse, I love For All Mankind. That there's something in that sci-fi space that we all gravitate towards, and trying to then take that. And I love the point you made about being an activist. How do we turn that? NARAD coined this term fan doing. How do we take that inherent love of science and space and activate it, empower it to then go do more good, right? To solve things together and collaborate, like you're talking about, John. For things like homelessness.
And I guess for me, the natural link is to find those groups that are already doing things in a sector and to partner with. Because I think to me, the one thing that I sometimes get concerned about is that so much of all the conversations we have all the time about change remain at a theoretical level, because it's hard to plug into the day in, day out building of something that actually has a set of achievable goals and objectives. And I think that's a challenge. If you talk about celebrityhood, celebrities are perfectly prepared to perhaps write a check or even to be a spokesman, and there may be some value in that. But there's a tendency to, and I say this as somebody who has minor celebrity, but there's a tendency in my community to ask somebody to do something and find that they are not responsive because you're wanting them to actually really dig in, and they don't want to really dig in. They are celebrities because that's their business. I think you have to be very careful about making sure that if you're utilizing people in this world, you're not overly imaginative about what their capacities are.
For sure.
It's the businesses, the social service organizations, and not-for-profits, the organizations that are fighting on the ground, that I think are doing things that have demonstrable value on the ground, that the scientific community might find more effective partnerships with. And that may be happening, and I'm just not aware of it. Forgive me.
No, I think it's something that takes intention on the part of these industries, these companies, they have to make that decision, that intentional decision and mindset shift to want to do it. So, so there's, and I think the idea of using sci-fi and the fandom, there's an inspiration there, but I think it does, to your point, like it should not rest on the shoulders of, hey, let's, just because John Billingsley is going to be there, like everybody's going to come, and it shouldn't rest on that, but it's the inspiration of what you do and what you have inspired.
I mean, the irony is that you bring me here because you know me from a Star Trek show, but my actual efficacy on the ground is rooted in actually being on the ground and deeply plugged in to an organization. I was the co-volunteer executive director and the board president. I'm intimately cognizant of how much work it takes to rescue and share food. That's my expertise, and it has nothing to do with the fact that I was on a sci-fi show. And connecting those two things, I think, is something that we've talked about. I don't know what the connectivity is. I don't know how you bring me as John Billingsley into this industry when all I want to do is say, come help the Hollywood Food Coalition rescue and share more food and build more support services for people in need.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. No, that's a great point, actually. Because maybe that misses the point. To your point, it's like more about how do we convince people. I don't know. This is great. I'm glad we're having this conversation. I mean, and I would love to.
I mean, there may be other people like me who can go in, and because I might have a better chance of getting an audience, I can tap dance for my organization. There may be celebrities who are willing to do that tap dance to lure organizations into the fold. I don't know, but I don't know whether or not you speak for organizations largely, whether there is the hunger, the interest, or the perception that that is what they should be doing or not. I don't know.
Yeah, I think food as medicine, both physically and mentally, is something that is often lost. So bringing that back around to both its function in space, both from a psychological standpoint and a physical standpoint. But then also back on Earth here, as loneliness is a big problem, right? Going back to the screen time and stuff, is how do we bring people back together at the table, right? How do we have more working together, especially in the physical sense. Food is that great medium there. So.
Well, and that's just what I do. I mean, there are any number of, there's Chase Masterson, who is in my universe, no pun intended, has been doing extraordinary work. And it's, I think, relevant to perhaps what you're talking about, Dr. Nelson. I think you might be interested in meeting her. She started something called Pop Culture Hero. It's an anti-bullying program that she's kind of now running on a national level that's helping kids by introducing them to popular sort of contemporary mythological heroes and teaching the lessons of anti-bullying and kindness through those popular kid-loved stories. But again, where is the space industry, just to say broadly what you guys represent, where is the space industry as a partner to her? That would be my question. And I'm not saying that in a challenging way. I mean, why would you? You may not even know she exists. But that's the kind of connectivity. I don't think it's a celebrity. I think it's a celebrity who's deeply invested in something. There aren't a lot of us on the ground necessarily, to be candid.
Yeah. But it's go ahead, Daniel.
Going from the Analog Astronaut Conference, a lot has been discussed around conflict resolution and using we're not there's gonna be a time latency period. So like you don't have 20 minutes. Mission control can't get on and tell you what to do and stuff. How do you trust the information? How do you just trust the decision support making tool? It's a lot like kids, right? Parents aren't always a minute phone call away. Hey, what do I do in this situation? So interesting kind of parallels there, and not having decision support mechanisms being always readily available, right? You have to take that independence as crew. I think they say, what is it? As soon as you're 4 minutes away, there's some time delay where they say, as soon as you're more than a 2-minute time delay from space, there is no mission control. You are mission control. That's the saying that's often said in the space community. And probably same thing, right? For a kid, right? As soon as
Yeah.
you're 2 blocks away from home, you are mission control, right?
Yeah.
That's, I mean, back when I was growing up, for sure. 8 to 5, Saturday and Sunday. That was, you were gone. I can't thank you enough. Maybe just to put a final point, well, not a final point clearly, but just on this particular conversation, it's we have to figure out how to, maybe John, what I'm thinking about more and not articulating very well is more of like the inspiration of Star Trek and Star Wars, like Dr. Nelson was talking about, like, how do we then use that to empower not only the space industry, but just people out there to truly think about space. And again, back to the whole theme of this conversation of making space mainstream, what is it that's going to get people to talk about it on a daily basis? Is it our cell phones?
And that's, I guess, my not, again, objection, but the talking means less to me than the doing.
For sure.
So it's if you can connect people in a community to your community and tie them to achievable tasks that help people, then you've got something. Otherwise, you've just got conversation. Yeah.
Oh, completely agree. And that, it's that is the ultimate, like, how do we empower them, activate them, to do something that's ultimately,
how do you identify those things that you want to do that have resonance, to your industry and that help
exactly.
And usually they're the most futuristic things. Like that's one thing that brings me into it. As much as I'm quote unquote part of the industry, I'm very on the edge of these things. So, if we spend tens of billions of dollars, right, to go to the moon, what does that mean? Are we able to stay there, right? Are we able to, what does staying in an extreme environment with limited resources mean for Earth? What is thriving there? Oh my goodness, if they can thrive on the moon, surely I can thrive here, wherever I am. So imagining those different possibilities, maybe it's 50 years or 100 years in the future, but imagining, hey, there are ways to do this. There are ways to, starting with very little, be able to grow. That, I think, is a powerful, as much as it's not a tangible necessarily, but it's not something that NASA necessarily and industry is really working on.
It would, from the Joe Schlabotnik point of view, that would be my, I suppose, challenge, is to say, convince me that the hundreds of millions of dollars that you want to spend to put us in space is worth it, because show me what you're able to do now that actually has value and meaning to me now, meaning to a lot of people now, so that I'll go along on that ride with you. If you don't do that, I won't go along on that ride with you.
And exploring how to live independent of Earth's natural resources, that's my mantra. What we come out of that, as far as fertilizer use or water use efficiency or plant breeding and stuff, biomanufacturing food, whatever. I think I don't have an answer to that. Trying to support those systems that will enable those answers, but I think that's a big question mark as we face limiting resources here on Earth. Is just how do you survive outside the system, really, outside the very natural system and the larger system that, as you've identified, has some failure points. It's kind of just going along more or less business as usual when we're facing a very, very real change that we're going to have to go through.
Well, I look at it the other way, though. I think if we let people think that there's another alternative and we're going to space for an alternative, it's not going to be a good sign. We have to do where we said the reason why we're doing is, number one, because we're curious. We can't stop curiosity. But if we're going to do this, we have to still remain vested in making sure that we use it to build a regenerative economy, which is eluding us right now. But maybe if we can be regenerative on the moon, we can start we'll change our behaviors on the Earth, so that with this finite thing we're talking about will no longer be finite, because we have found energy systems here that are renewable and are not as toxic for our environment. And I'm hoping that's what we'll find. We'll find ways of doing stuff that can help us to save this beautiful blue marble.
To continue to grow just outside of oil is a massive challenge. That's totally underrated. So if we can in any way solve very basic needs, space is instantly a filter for a post-oil world. So if we can find a way to go to, land with a system that supports 2 people and build that system out to support 3 people and 6 people and 12 people, if we can, there's no greenwashing, there's no, there's not the messiness necessarily of Earth-based systems getting in the way of creating that. So, and it will use biology. Biology is a massive toolbox on Earth that we can utilize to, no one talks about, oh, what's that microbe in a wastewater treatment system that does this to nitrogen, that to nitrogen? I mean, there's independent of Earth, but definitely not without biology and not without some relevance to here on Earth.
I think for those of us who are not in your community, the challenge is, for me, is as if, and it's a little bit of what Roddenberry did. I see a beautiful world, but I don't see the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
And I need the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm to, as you said,
Yeah.
UB, think of space and your businesses and your goals and your explorations the same way I do Starbucks, as a natural, integral, critical part of my day in, day out life. I don't know that is actually an achievable goal in all candor, but to the extent that I understand the ethos behind it is to encourage more people to be on one side of a divide than another, an intellectual divide. Then I think you've got to find a way to encourage people to say, oh, I see the pertinence. I see the point. I see how you're intending to teach us how to be better so that we can eventually get to here. If you say we're going to get to here, and when we're there, that will model to us how we can be better, it's like, but you've put the cart before the horse.
Yeah. That's a great point.
Yeah, and so much of the basic sciences, right, is also this pillar of, in microgravity we can do all these novel things. The increase in basic science doesn't necessarily lead to near term direct tangible results on Earth, right? These are the foundational basic sciences. That's one narrative. I think the other narrative is this eventually space settlement is totally underrated. Is no one's really trying to solve this in a very real sense. There's no driver for it. There's no demand signal for it. Just as, there's very few places on Earth where people are living absent of fossil fuel, right? There's very few places on Earth where it's just like, you know what? Forget oil. We're going to do a whole system that's totally independent. We don't even have to ship in, solar panels from Asia or whatnot. We're going to live totally local and independent of fossil fuels. I mean, that is incredibly rare. Just not necessarily a model system per se for the future, the way that maybe space can be. So,
well, I think this is great for saying thank you, and this is a great part 1 in my mind, probably 50 parts at least of this conversation, because it clearly, like, it's something, to your point, John, there is a bridge that we need to design and architect and build. But again, that's why we're having this conversation. I will say this is a conversation that does come up quite a bit in the space industry, because I think now they realize that in the past, this legacy, non-transparency that existed, right? Like everything was very secretive and, nobody could talk about it. And that still exists in some way, but there is this new crop of companies and this new commercial industry that we're seeing expand and grow that wants to be talking about it more and as a step towards getting everyone else on this planet interested. And so thank you, John Billingsley. Thank you, Dr. Claire Nelson. Again, we could keep talking for hours, I think, on this. But thank you both very much. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you to Meredith. This is a conversation I think we will definitely have a part 2 at some point, just to maybe catch up and see where we're at with our goals. So thank you all, the audience, and for always being here. We really, really Take care, everyone.